honor to have been invited to the ICMART conference. I want to thank the organizing committee for extending the invitation. Today, it's my pleasure to talk to you about the Institute of Cannabis Research, which is located at Colorado State University-Pueblo. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the ICR is, what kind of activities we support, as well as some of the research that is being conducted or supported through the ICR, and then give kind of a snapshot of what research trends look like in the state of Colorado where we are and nationally in the United States. Now, it's very common that when you mention that you work at an institute that has cannabis in the name, that you get a fairly strong reaction. But the reality is that the ICR is dedicated to research. Our primary mission is the generation of new knowledge related to cannabis and also the dissemination of that information. Hopefully, the results of this research, or in cannabis research in general, will result in some benefits for mankind. So the ICR was formed in 2016 as a result of legislation passed by the Colorado State Legislature providing funding to Colorado State University-Pueblo for the purpose of education and research related to cannabis. At the time, Pueblo County, where the university is located, also provided some additional funding to support the ICR. I think it's probably fairly straightforward as to how the ICR might support research. We essentially act as a funding agency to do so. But in terms of the dissemination of that research, we have two very active roles that we take in that process. The first of which is hosting an international conference, the fourth of which will occur this upcoming spring. We have also partnered with Springer Nature to launch the Journal of Cannabis Research, which published its first issue this past June. I think it's important to acknowledge that conducting research and navigating the area of cannabis research in general is very tricky, and everything that the ICR supports is federally compliant in the United States. I think one of the easiest ways to look at what the ICR supports is to look at how its budget is utilized. So in terms of dissemination, support for the Journal of Cannabis Research, as well as for the conference, makes up just under 10% of our annual budget. Research makes up the largest portion of the budget, almost 70%. And then, of course, we have operational costs in terms of personnel and administration of the ICR. Our annual conference, the next one is coming up in April of 2020, is a truly multidisciplinary conference that is focused on a variety of areas of cannabis research that you can see on the left-hand side of the slide. We seek to bring world experts in cannabis research to participate in the conference, and that's represented in the keynote speakers for this upcoming conference. Dr. Roger Pertwee has over 40 years of cannabis research. He's currently a professor emeritus at Aberdeen University in Scotland, and he will be delivering the Meshulam lecture at the conference. Dr. Marilyn Huetes, who has almost 30 years of research activity with the National Institute of Drugs and Abuse, or NIDA in the United States, will be giving the opening plenary presentation. The Journal of Cannabis Research that I mentioned was launched last fall, just over a year ago. The first issue was published in June. You can see some of the papers that were published in that first issue on the right of the slide. And again, much like the conference, this is an interdisciplinary journal meant to cover a wide variety of areas of research related to cannabis. Anybody who's interested in the type of research that the ICR supports only has to go to our website to find that information. We have a link for current research studies, and these are just some of the topics or titles of the projects that are currently funded this fiscal year. going to take a little bit of time to talk about some of the research projects that I thought folks might find interesting. I'm going to start with some neuroscience work that is led by Dr. Jeff Smith in the biology department. And they're interested in the influence of cannabinoids on learning and memory, and specifically to look for cannabinoids that might have some therapeutic action with respect to learning and memory disorders. So they use Pavlovian fear conditioning to prepare mice that have an associated fear memory, and then look to see what effects certain cannabinoids will have on that fear memory. Okay. They have specifically worked with CBD, or cannabidiol, and HU211, which is a synthetic cannabinoid. They use electrophysiology to look at drug-dependent effects and brain histology to look at, to distinguish neuron activation during memory acquisition. More recently, they have started working with transgenic mice in an effort to do neural network mapping. Just a couple of key results from their work. What's really interesting is they see sexual dimorphism with respect to the influence of CBD in the mice. We actually see that CBD enhances fear memory in the male mice, while it reduces fear memory in the female mice. Again, with the synthetic cannabinoid HU211, they also do see some divergent effects, with HU211 resulting in an inhibition of fear memory in the female mice. One of the interesting things with respect to Dr. Smith's work was when the ICR was first created and he wanted to do some work with CBD, he had trouble getting enough CBD to do that work. And this was because what was available at the time were low concentration analytical standards that could be purchased from scientific suppliers. And they would buy a bunch of them, have to evaporate off the solvent, reconstitute the material in the solvent that they needed for their particular research. And it just was not an efficient process. They had losses in the process of getting the CBD into the desired solvent. So then they looked to industry to help them out. And they had several people that were willing to supply CBD for research purposes. I'm an analytical chemist, and so Dr. Smith provided some subsamples of the materials that he received, and we analyzed them. They weren't quite as pure as the industrial partners led them to believe. And in fact, there were frequently other cannabinoids that were present in these samples, including THC. When looking for cause and effect relationships, it's kind of complicated when you are not working with the pure substance. So that brings me to some of the research that has gone on in my research group, looking for efficient methods for extraction of cannabinoids from industrial hemp and isolation from the bulk extract. Now, we initially focused on CBD because of a great deal of interest in CBD, and we employ a technique called pressurized liquid extraction. Now, most of my research background does not relate to cannabis. It's actually environmental chemistry. And we would frequently use pressurized liquid extraction as a method to extract organic molecules from a variety of samples, including plant samples. And so we thought we'd see if we could apply this to extraction of cannabinoids from industrial hemp. What we found is that if we use an organic solvent, such as ethanol, we are going to get the native cannabinoids extracted from the plant. As we heard initially, things like CBD exist as an acidic form, CBDA, and other cannabinoids such as THC actually start as THCA, the acidic form, unless you heat the sample. Well, if you heat a sample post-extraction, frequently you will degrade some of the cannabinoids in the process. So we look for a way to actually carry out decarboxylation, conversion of the acidic form to the neutral form in our extraction process. And we actually found that if we extract the hemp sample with water as a solvent, we can carry out decarboxylation without loss of any of the cannabinoids, because the cannabinoids are not soluble in water. And so that's actually shown, let's see here, in this middle chromatogram here, we don't see any of the cannabinoids present. That is the water extract. After we have extracted the plant sample with water, or what we have now begun to refer to as our water pre-extraction, followed by extraction with the organic solvent, we actually see that decarboxylation has occurred, and our CBDA is now CBD. Of course, this is true of other acidic cannabinoids as well, so THCA has been converted to THC. In order to support our colleagues with respect to providing them with individual cannabinoids, we can't just stop here. We have to isolate the individual cannabinoids of interest from the bulk extract, and we have been working to do so using, there we go, we use flash chromatography in order to isolate cannabidiol from our bulk extract. And this is an image from some of our early work where you can see we have a very large peak that corresponds to CBD. We do have trace amounts of other cannabinoids present, and we're working to fully isolate the CBD, but we'll also repeat this for some of the other cannabinoids as well. As I mentioned, using that water pre-extraction does not just decarboxylate CBD, but will effectively decarboxylate other cannabinoids as well. And so I have a couple of examples here. CBDVA and CBDVA and CBDV. And what we see is that as we increase the temperature, the acidic form decreases, eventually getting below our lowest calibration point for our instrument. And as heat increases, we see a neutral form increase in both instances. I want to touch on one other research project. Unfortunately, in the United States right now, there is an opioid epidemic where we have a lot of individuals that are abusing opioid-containing medications, and ultimately is a fairly high rate of opioid-related overdose deaths. What we have seen is that there's been a sharp increase in the number of prescriptions of opioid-containing medications. In fact, in the 10-year period from 1999 to 2010, the number of opioid-containing medication prescriptions increased by 400% in the United States, and this was paralleled by a dramatic increase in the number of overdose deaths as well. So some of our colleagues have been looking at what effect has legalization of cannabis had in terms of opioid deaths, and specifically in Colorado. And so looking at about a 20-year period that includes some time prior to legalization of medicinal cannabis, as well as post-legalization of recreational cannabis, this shows the number of opioid overdose deaths by month, and we can look at this data represented in another way. And in this particular slide, you'll see that there are a couple of vertical dashed lines that show up, one for November of 2000, the other for May of 2014. These correspond to important dates related to cannabis in the state of Colorado. In November of 2000 is when medicinal cannabis was started to be sold, and in May of 2014 is when recreational cannabis started to be sold in the state. And the way this data is represented here is that prior to legalization of medicinal cannabis, there's a particular trend with respect to opioid overdose deaths. And if that trend were to continue, we would be on this dashed line. But what we see is that there is a downturn in the number of opioid deaths from 2000 to 2014. Similarly, if we look at 2014 here, we see if this trend continued, it would be this dashed line. But in reality, what we have seen is that there has actually started to be a reduction in the number of opioid opioid-related deaths. Now, does this mean that legalization of cannabis is the reason or the sole reason for this? And the answer is that's not necessarily the case, because there's a couple of other important factors that occurred in 2014 and beyond, and the first of which is this prescription drug monitoring policy. So in response to the high rate of opioid prescriptions, the state put into practice this prescription monitoring program or policy to dissuade physicians from over-prescribing opioids. So that also corresponds to when legalization of recreational cannabis occurred. And then the other aspect is we have to take into account that the anti-overdose drug Narcan has become widely distributed within the state of Colorado, which is also going to prevent some overdose deaths. So how do we try to get at some of the information as to whether there is an impact from legalization of cannabis? And the researchers working on this project did so by looking at the fact that not every county within the state does the same thing. Some counties do not allow the sale of recreational or medicinal cannabis. Some counties allow the sale of medicinal cannabis but not recreational, and vice versa. And what they actually see is that in the counties that allow both medical and recreational cannabis, they've seen the largest shift in terms of the number of opioid deaths. And if you look at the county where there's no medical and no recreational cannabis sold, we see a nice steady trend. Yes, there's a fair bit of scatter in the data, but there's no downshift in terms of the number of opioid-related overdose deaths, providing some circumstantial evidence to suggest that legalization of cannabis has had an effect. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about cannabis research in general in the United States. Certainly there have long been barriers to conducting cannabis-related research. Historically, some of these barriers are the fact that cannabis is a Schedule I compound, which we heard about. There was a single source of cannabis, that being the NIDA facility at Mississippi State University. And certainly there has been a stigma in terms of doing research with cannabis, and historically a poor public perception related to cannabis. With legalization, we've seen a shift in some of those barriers. Now, high THC cannabis is still a Schedule I compound, meaning that you have to have a Schedule I license from the Drug Enforcement Agency in order to conduct research with it or to handle the substance. There have also been shifts in terms of distinguishing high THC cannabis from low THC cannabis. So beginning in 2014, with the Farm Bill, Congress allowed for states that had a regulatory framework for cannabis for institutions of higher education to conduct research with industrial hemp. And then more recently in 2018, they have removed industrial hemp from the scheduling list and actually now treat it as an agricultural commodity. Legalization of cannabis has largely been fueled by public opinion, so a substantial shift in how people view cannabis. In the state of Colorado, for instance, it was by a ballot measure that recreational cannabis was legalized. And so the stigma is lifted a little bit, and public perception has certainly changed over the years. However, individual states have individual laws, which creates a little bit of difficulty when thinking about cannabis research. So just a brief history on legalization of cannabis in the United States. In 1996, California was the first state to legalize medicinal cannabis. Several other states followed suit shortly thereafter. Today, 47 of the 50 states have some form of medicinal cannabis that is legal. Recreational cannabis legalization occurred several years later. Colorado and Washington states were the first to pass ballot measures legalizing cannabis, and a few other states have now legalized cannabis for recreational purposes as well, but still a minority of the states have legalized recreational cannabis. The federal response to this has essentially been to allow states to do what they want to do. They have defunded enforcement action at the federal level. So Congress has essentially said, we will not provide the financial resources. You cannot use financial resources for enforcement at the federal level. And then I mentioned the two farm bills ultimately leading to industrial hemp becoming an agricultural commodity. This leaves us in a bit of a conundrum at this point because individual states have individual laws, some legalizing high THC cannabis for medicinal and recreational purposes, others only legalizing it for medicinal purposes, and some not legalizing at all. But at the federal level, it's still illegal. And so think about a university that receives federal funding. The state wants it to do research related to cannabis, but they have to follow federal regulations in order to maintain federal funding. Okay? All the while, there are people using cannabis for both recreational and medicinal purposes without a great deal of guidance on what is safe to do. Match that with limited federal funding for research related to cannabis, and it still makes working with cannabis and doing cannabis research a challenge. So this shows a map with respect to legalization in the United States. Those states in blue is where recreational cannabis is legal. We have a couple different shades of green there. These are states in which some form of medicinal cannabis is legal. And then we have 3 states that are in gray. Those are the states that do not have any legal form of cannabis. Not only is it different across the states, but it's even different within the states. And this goes back to the study I was talking about with opioids. So within the state of Colorado, those counties that are in green are the only ones that sell recreational cannabis. Now, those in the center of the state here in the Denver metro area is where there's a very high population center. In many of the other counties that are in red, they do allow for medicinal cannabis sales. So this is simply my observation, this is my opinion that I am giving, is that I believe that legalization of cannabis in its various forms in several states has stimulated research rather than research stimulating legalization. What this means is that research is playing catch-up. We are trying to catch up to what the public is doing, to understand what is safe, what is not safe, what are the benefits, what are the risks that are going on. There's a lot of anecdotal observations out there in terms of the benefits of cannabis, but which of those are real and which are not? So we are certainly in a situation where the cart has been put before the horse. You can go online and it's very easy to find a wide range of claims for the benefits of cannabis. Now I've blacked out a couple portions of the slide because I'm not trying to pick on any one company or website, but there's a website that has a list of the top 71 medical uses of cannabis. And they're in alphabetical order, including things like treatment of acne, treatment for addiction, treatment for aging, so it's age serum, I guess. And I am sure, I'm fairly confident that among those top medical applications that are listed, some are probably correct. I'm also fairly confident that some of them probably are not correct. We have organizations that promote the use of cannabis during pregnancy, and this is certainly countered then by concerns related to cannabis. The CDC lists all sorts of concerns and risks that somebody takes if they use cannabis during pregnancy. We've seen a rise in cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome that is also referred to as scromiting, which takes 2 words, screaming and vomiting, and putting them together. because this patients that have this syndrome have long bouts of very severe vomiting that is very painful, that is usually comes with screaming, and so they have coined the term scromiting to describe this. And there certainly has been an increase in the number of ER visits related to marijuana overdose. And I would point to the fact that a lot of this has to do with the fact that there is not good information about how much is too much, how much should be used for certain symptoms, so on and so forth. There simply is not a great deal of information out there for the public to work with. Now, we've hit on some of the risks, we've hit on some of the concerns that are out there, but I also think that there are certainly some benefits that are being identified. Researchers at Harvard have identified a flavonoid from cannabis that has anti-pancreatic cancer therapeutic uses. And of course, we've already heard about Cannabidiolic, which is the first FDA-approved cannabis-derived drug that is used to treat 2 severe forms of childhood epilepsy. At the federal level, research support is slowly coming towards cannabis research. There's always been some resources available in terms of addiction research, but now we're seeing that NIH is interested in potential analgesic effects of minor cannabinoids. So we're talking about the cannabinoids other than THC and CBD. And the USDA is starting to look at funding research related to industrial hemp. But right now, most of the research is coming from individual states. Take the state of Colorado, for example, and of course they provide the funding for the Institute of Cannabis Research on our campus. They provide research for clinical studies through the Colorado Department of Health and Environment. And then you have individual universities that are starting up their own research organizations, such as at CU. State of California, another example where the state is putting money into medicinal cannabis research. The Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego, the Cannabis Research Initiative at UCLA are examples of this. More recently in Oregon, the state has created the Global Hemp Research Center at Oregon State University. And more we're seeing that universities are getting into the business of educating students related to cannabis. And the first of which, at least I believe the first of which, was Northern Michigan University with their medicinal plant chemistry degree program. The chemistry department saw a doubling in the number of majors within a couple of years after they started this program. And while it is not exclusively related to cannabis, that is a major component. We're seeing other universities adding courses and doing research, including some fairly prevalent universities. And of course, Colorado State University-Pueblo with the Institute of Cannabis Research is also interested in doing this. We have a cannabis studies minor currently, and this fall we have proposed a cannabis biology and chemistry degree program with a track that is focused on biology and one that is focused on chemistry. If it is approved, it will become a new program next fall, and we're also looking at some certificate programs. With that, I will conclude. I want to acknowledge the state of Colorado for providing funding through an appropriation to the Institute of Cannabis Research, which supported some of the research that I talked about today.